maybe there's some way I could have looked this up, but can you imagine all the dollars that are spent for food plots on an annual basis? Millions of dollars, I'm sure. And at the same time, a lot of effort goes into that, a lot of time, a lot of resources. And if you're like me, it seems like you don't have a lot of time to get this stuff done. And I'm on everyone else's properties, working on property and whitetail properties around the country. And you can imagine when I have time to plant food plots, when I want to put them in, I do not want any failures. Failures, food plots, they go hand in hand every single year. So many clients that I go to have gone through a series of failures. And I did too. That's how you learn, you know, starting back in the mid-90s planting food plots. Now there's a couple different types of failures. We're going to talk crop failure. One of the failures that I see that I really would like you to avoid is spooking deer off those food plots. You know, that's a big failure. If you have a food plot, every time you enter your property, exit your property, go into tree stands to hunt, you have to walk through that plot and you're spooking deer. That's a #1 food plot failure. That's right up there with one of the ones I'll talk about towards the end. But that's a big failure if you're actually inviting deer into that location and you spook them off, and we'll expand on that in another video. First failure, and if you could look around me right here, we haven't planted this. We're not expecting to plant this for another 2 weeks. That'll be early or mid-August, and it'll be perfect timing for what we want to do in this location and try to get the most crops available, the most food, the highest volume going into the hunting season so that we can hunt on this little plot. It's a little hunting plot. So my goal is to get the most volume of an adequate food source here, and we're gonna do that. But weeds, I go to so many food plots. Let's say it's an 8-acre food plot, a 4-acre food plot, and 50% of the forage in there or 50% of the crop in there is weeds. And you can imagine, obviously, if it's half weeds, those weeds are actually sucking available moisture. So it's not just that they're taking up half that space, they're diminishing the value of the forage they actually have planted in that plot. And so 8 acres can turn into 2 acres of food pretty quick, 4 acres into 1 acre. So you can kind of see those weeds can be drastic. So every weed control measure that you can take, that goes along with no-till planting really well, because you can control your weeds, whether you're broadcasting seed like brassica, clover, maybe chicory, those can all, alfalfa, those can all be planted on the soil, winter wheat, rye, all be thrown right on top of the soil, and with moisture they'll take off really well. So you can get your soil exposed by multiple sprayings of herbicide, and then when you go into planting early August and throwing that seed on the soil and you get good growth, and you have a lot of crop going into the hunting season with a very, very low percentage of weeds. I've taken crops like that for years. I've done that in Wisconsin, I did that in the UP of Michigan and Minnesota. I have clients do that every year. If you have limited resources, it works. If you have a lease that's 7 hours away and you're traveling down there, then spraying 3 times during the summer, following up with throwing that seed on top of the soil. And I have articles about that. If you look up no-till plantings, I discuss that in a couple different ways. Great way to limit your weeds and then have a great crop going into the hunting season. I've taken crops with probably 95% forage or greater, but making sure that you have your weeds. You know, every time you till up the soil, you're just bringing more weeds. So if you spray in mid-July, late July, you disc up, till up the soil, plow up the soil, you're bringing up more weed seeds, you throw your crop in, you're gonna have a high percentage of weeds. Whatever you can do to limit the weed growth. Another big plot failure I see is spring planted perennials. So you're trying to get a clover field, alfalfa field established, and you plant that in spring. Everyone thinks you got to get out with food plots and plant in the spring. Well, moisture increases as fall progresses. You go into winter time, and then as April progresses, May, June, moisture is shrinking each month to a point where when there's drought that takes place, a lot of times it's the end of June, July, August. And if you have that spring planted perennial, that was my one crop failure back major that I had, was a May planted, it was actually a brassica crop and clover. That was in 1999 or 2000. So the brassica crop was completely consumed by July. I learned that it doesn't need frost to be eaten. That was 99 in the middle of the UP of Michigan, no ag land anywhere. The deer didn't know anything other than it was a fresh green food source, and they hammered it. What was left was the clover. And so while the brassica acted as a nurse crop for a while, it was gone by July sometime. And that clover sat there. I remember we had less than an inch of rain in 9 weeks, and by the time that 9 weeks was over, my clover was a fizzled, sandy, exposed food plot, and there was no growth, and no growth lived. So you're planting those perennials, I like to add those to my fall annuals. For example, brassicas and clover and chicory and alfalfa does really well. And so does even using winter wheat or rye over that crop. You can kill that grass out in the spring. You could add more perennial in the spring if you want, frost eating clover, chicory. And so it makes it a lot more advantageous for you to be able to actually plant in the fall, establish that perennial base if you want that, if that's a fit on your land. And then by the time you get into a summer dormancy the following year or summer drought, you have enough root base and root structure that's going to withstand that drought. Now, another failure that I see all the time is you're planting that fall planting, it's in August, and you're not planting with moisture in the immediate forecast. So let's say you put that seed in, you don't get rain for 3.5 weeks, there's going to be a high percentage of that seed that dies, and then that seed's not going to be very healthy, it germinates slowly, and you could have a very poor food plot going into the fall, as opposed to you see that rain coming and you plant a few days prior, and even though you're getting the same germination dates on that seed, you're getting full seed growth, full healthy seed growth, and you're taking a great crop into the fall. Now, the next thing, consumption of the forage. And this is a big thing. Brassica is a little susceptible to that in northern regions where there's no other green food source, no ag land, and other crops, including soybeans. Go to a lot of food plots. Let's say your food plot was droughted out, didn't get any rain in August, September, heavily consumed by deer. Maybe you had some bad seed, some bad planting methods. Maybe you put that brassica in a 1/2 inch deep and it didn't grow. Maybe some turkeys came through and picked all your rye off the top, whatever it was. There's a lot of failures where you get into the hunting season, you just don't have a lot of forage. Folks, the easiest remedy to that is if you're in northern Michigan, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, upstate New York, just throw 200 to 300 pounds of rye on your food plot, and I would say in the first to second week of September, right around there, up to the third week of September, and enjoy the season. That winter rye is going to germinate. You put a huge amount of seed on so the little critters and birds and chipmunks can't get everything, and then you're going to develop a low, lush sod base. And remember, your rye, you're not looking to take the full height and full maturity. You're trying to fill space this way, not this way, because you're not going to get this. It's a late planting. Now, if you're in southern Michigan, southern Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, over into Missouri, southern Minnesota, Pennsylvania, great timing for that is more the end of September, right around October 1st. You can put 200 to 300 pounds of winter rye right on top of your soil. You're looking to get, instead of a sprig of rye every 3 or 4 inches, like with a traditional 100 pounds per acre planting or 90 pounds, you're looking to get a sprig of rye every inch, every 3/4 of an inch, so it develops almost a sod base and a mat. Now, I can be honest, the number one crop failure that I see of crops that have great intentions, great ability, is actually a soybean planting. Now, soybeans are a great fit with a lot of lands, and but at the same time, when you have too many deer and too few of acres of food plot space, I can't tell you how many soybean plantings that I have seen down to the dirt by the beginning of bow season or even before bow season. I can think of one up in, it was north of Eau Claire, up in that area in Wisconsin, and the person had 3 acres of food plot space, and we went over, this planting guide and what should be planted. They purchased the magic bean, so to say, and they planted that on their 3 acres. Now there's no ag within 2 miles, so a heavily wooded area, and there's a few deer there, moderate number. But boy, it doesn't take long to totally consume a 3-acre bean field when you're surrounded by woods. You don't have any ag to help support that feeding pressure every single day. And those deer just pounding that 5 times in a 24-hour period, because they're rhythmic pattern feeders. That's how often they feed per 24 hours. And instead of that feeding being 1.5 or 1 time a day, and they're going out in the ag fields, your neighbor's food plots, that feeding probably represented for some deer 5 times in a 24-hour period. And it was down to the dirt by October 1st. So be careful on the soybeans. What I encourage in an average setting, you should have about 5 acres of soybeans to make sure that they make it through. And then again, if you have a lot of soybeans in the area, they might leave those soybeans alone for the middle part of the season, October, November. If you have extreme temperatures, great snow in December, I've seen bean fields be the biggest magnet in the area. I've also seen them rotting in the spring in that same location because there was a mild winter. The deer didn't have to leave their fall habitats, and they just simply didn't go to that bean field where there were 45 deer feeding on it all winter the year before. The next year, they didn't move out of their fall areas, and that bean field rotted in the spring. Number one crop failure. You think of all those ways, and again, even with that bean field, you can always remedy that with, again, putting 200 to 300 pounds of winter rye over the top of it. You see your beans are going this way in September, not this way. They're not gaining that full height and that full volume. When you see that happening, there's no excuse. That's not just to throw some winter rye down the ground at 200 to 300 pounds per acre and enjoy the season. You don't have to disc it in, till it in, call the packet in. Just throw it so that seed's right on the soil. I've been doing that literally for 20 years. It works. It's a great remedy to any of the plot failures we discussed, except that plot where you're walking through and spooking those deer out every single time you hunt or every single time you exit your land while you're hunting during the season. So there's always a remedy, and in that case, I'd move the plot, get rid of it, cut it in half, screen it better, whatever you have to do. But no reason to take soil into the hunting season ever. Make sure you have that nice green crop going in, and there's a lot of ways to make sure that you have a foolproof food plot going into the hunting season. I discuss a lot of those on my YouTube channel and on my website.